Danielle, can you start off by just telling us how you first got involved in this therapy and why you were attracted to it?
Yeah, so I am a social worker by trade, and 6 years ago I lost my brother Brian to suicide. And shortly after that, I got involved with AFSP and was able to attend one of the support group facilitator trainings. I found that experience to be exceptionally rewarding, and shortly thereafter, I started a support group monthly here at the VA in San Diego. I really loved the opportunity to be able to work with people monthly in this population, and shortly thereafter got involved with the complicated grief study. So at that time I was able to go through the complicated grief training, and shortly thereafter got certified, and I have been working for 3 years now as a certified complicated grief therapist.
Okay. And I know, have been sending you most of our suicide bereaved individuals in the study. You've probably done more therapy with suicide bereaved participants than anyone else. So you've had a lot of experience with
I
this
have,
population. Are there any ways that you've noticed that the participants in the study, or who you've seen otherwise, with suicide bereavement, are in any way different than other individuals with complicated grief?
Yeah, I have seen a difference. So the interesting thing is that, on paper they don't present any differently. So their complicated grief levels are about the same as people who've lost someone other ways. But in the session they present much differently. They're just more stuck. This population is uniquely different in that they're struggling with the guilt associated with the loss. They're struggling with making sense of the loss. They're struggling with the anger they might have towards the person who chose to take their life, the anger they might have towards the mental health professionals who didn't do enough. I mean, there's a lot of things that are keeping people stuck, and they present much differently in session.
Okay, so those are some of the themes that you come up against. Any other kind of recurrent themes that you've noticed in this population?
Really, the biggest one I would say is the guilt. People feel really guilty, and they're having a really hard time processing that.
Okay. And in general, about how long is it after the death that most of these people present themselves to you?
That's another thing that's interesting and different, is that most of the patients I've worked with, it's been 4 years at least. So I've had a number of people 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, up to 15 years since the loss, and they're still really stuck and really suffering. Whereas most of the other people that we've worked with are as early as 1-2 years in.
And when you say stuck and suffering, can you explain what you mean by suffering a little bit?
Yeah, so they're having difficulty enjoying life again. They're preoccupied with the loss. They're no longer doing the things that they once enjoyed doing. They're ruminating about the loss. They just can't come to terms with the loss, and it's impacting their life in just about every way possible.
And I imagine most start treatment thinking that there's no way you can be very much help.
Yes.
What's your experience been with the way they responded?
Yeah.
Treatment?
The one thing that I really love about doing this work is that in session 1, when people come in, they are so hopeless, and they really look at this as their last resort. And they think there is just no way that we can help them. And it's such an amazing thing to know, I am going to help you, and that by week 16 we're going to get you to a great place. And so I often tell them that I know that you don't have the hope right now, but I'm going to carry the hope for you, because I know that we're going to get you to a great place at week 16. And I can tell you that we haven't had one person, suicide bereaved or otherwise, that hasn't come through this therapy and gotten their life back. So it's really inspiring.
Now, you mentioned to me earlier as we were talking that those people who have come to therapy within a year or so after the loss may be a little bit different. What's your experience there?
My feeling is that this type of therapy is very intensive, and it's really emotionally challenging. And for people who've lost someone to suicide, to do this type of work within the first year or two, it's just too difficult. I mean, we are digging up some really painful things that I don't think people are prepared for. And so what we found is that people often drop out because it's just too much for them. So I think that a lot of healing and some first steps need to happen before a therapy like this would be really helpful. And that's what we're seeing here.
Okay. You mentioned the first session, people often come in feeling really hopeless. The third or fourth session is when people bring in a significant other.
Yeah.
What have you noticed there?
You know, that's always a great way for me to get a different perspective on the person and the way it's changed their life. It's often very emotional because the person that they bring in realizes that their loved one is suffering and they just don't know how to help them. And so they are usually so supportive and so happy to see them getting help and really believe in us. And so it's a great thing to be able to tell the person that they bring in that, you know, we're gonna help them get there. And so it's always a great session.
Do they sometimes find different ways that they can be helpful?
Yeah, that's a big part of the session, is that, you know, brainstorming ways that they can be supportive, because again, this therapy is so challenging and we really want to get people to connect with people in their lives.
Do you have an
get
example
support.
of how someone has been able to do that?
Yeah, so one of the ways is that we just had somebody give them a phone call every week or go to the movies once a week after they did one of their revisiting exercises, which is a particularly challenging exercise that we do in this therapy.
So the phone calls and the movies may not have been something they've been doing for the 4 or 5 or 6 years previously.
Exactly, and partly because the person that I'm treating has really isolated and doesn't want that from anybody. And so bringing that person in allows a dialogue to say, we need to start really focusing on getting that support back.
And one of the hallmarks of this therapy is the revisiting experiences. Can you give us an example or a vignette of revisiting and how that's gone in the therapy?
Yeah, so I was working with a male, 33 years old, who had lost his best friend to suicide. He had hung himself 4 years prior in the home that they shared. And so this loss was particularly challenging because my patient was struggling with the trauma, not just the loss of losing his best friend, but he was struggling with the trauma of finding his friend and not being able to save him. So the revisiting exercise is designed to do the story of the death. And so it was exceptionally challenging for him because he had to tell that story out loud and listen to it again and again and again. But what it did was it helped us process it. It helped us talk about it. It helped him to be able to dialogue in a way that he hadn't been able to do before. And it freed him in many ways because beforehand he was really re-experiencing on a regular basis the event of finding his friend and the fear that he had when he was looking through the house and couldn't find him. And by the end of the revisiting, he no longer had the re-experiencing and that anxiety, the fear that he used to have when he would go into the home.
Do you think it's just doing it over and over again kind of desensitizing, or is there some other component?
Yeah, I think it's a number of things. So we don't necessarily want it to desensitize, as we want you to come to terms with what happened and make the unthinkable thinkable. And so by talking about it, by processing it with the therapist, and by listening to it at home, you are now being exposed more often to that story, and you're able to think of it in different ways and process it and take the unthinkable and make it thinkable.
Okay. And another one of the kind of highlights of this treatment is the imaginal conversation that occurs a little bit later in the therapy.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. This conversation is one of the most powerful tools that we have in this therapy. And it's not right for everybody because it is very challenging. But again, in this particular case with the 33-year-old man I was working with, he was really angry with his best friend. He was so mad that his friend would make this choice, and he had all kinds of unresolved issues with his friend that was really keeping him stuck. So the conversation is designed for the patient to be able to say some things that they haven't been able to say and to hear back in their friend's words a response. So by having this conversation, he was able to hear in his friend's words, I just couldn't do it anymore. I tried everything I could. He was able to hear his friend's voice, which was something he wasn't able to do before. So by having this conversation, he was able to have some newfound empathy and understanding. Didn't mean he liked the result. In fact, he was still mad in some ways that it happened. But he was able to have some empathy and understanding, which really freed him from being so stuck that way.
Okay. The last question I want to ask you about is, I know this therapy can be difficult and challenging for the therapist as well.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, as a survivor yourself, have you encountered any particular challenges or difficulties in doing this kind of therapy?
You know, Sid, I really haven't found any challenges in this. In fact, what I found is it's probably the most meaningful thing I've ever done in my life. I find it so I'm so lucky that I'm able to take the loss of my brother and help others. And so I always start my first session by being very honest with my patients and telling them that I've lost someone to suicide and that it's a real honor to be able to work with them. So I find it very meaningful, and it's wonderful to be able to connect with other survivors and give them much needed help that I know is going to really change their life.
Any other messages for the leadership of the AFSP who's going to be hearing this?
Wow, well, I have to thank them for supporting this project, because with their support we've been able to reach out to many more survivors than we probably would have. And clearly there's a need for this, because we know that people that have lost someone to suicide have higher rates of complicated grief. So they're suffering, and we need to reach out to them. And I think the more people that we can help, the better.
Thank you.
You're welcome.